how these structures can continue to develop over the very long term. People say, look, Bob, you're telling me that the 1980s bull market in stocks is somehow related to this bull market of the 1930s. When all of the people who were participating in the market back then, or most of them certainly, have long since passed away. Certainly, even if they're around now, they're not trading like they were back then. How can you tell me that something that these speculators did back 50 years ago has anything whatsoever to do with what's going on in the 1980s? Well, let's forget the empirical side of it first. Elliott's observation that they do, and therefore you've got to deal with that rather than just trying to deny the fact that it happens, and try to figure out why events that occurred years or decades or perhaps even centuries ago have anything to do with what's going on today. Well, I used to try to give an explanation that referred to the way cultural values are transmitted over a period of time, but I never could formulate an answer as eloquently as a sports writer could. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs from one of the great sports writers and see if we can get some insight into the answer to this question from his observations on the aftermath of a football game. This happened to be an article that came out in November of 1984 describing what happened after the Florida Gators won the Southeastern Conference Football Championship for the first time in the history of that university. Now, for the moment, we won't discuss all the ramifications of what developed afterwards. Just suffice it to understand that for 50 years, this football team, or let's say this university, had participated in the Southeast Conference, the SEC, and had never once won the title. And this year they did. And here's how it was described. And when the scoreboard clock struck 0, 5 decades of frustration burst into 5 minutes of glorious joy. Gerald Wilkins, a reserve linebacker, sprinted to midfield, flung himself to the turf, and writhed in ecstasy. Elaine Hall, the coach's wife, leaped to kiss Lomas Brown, the offensive tackle, on the cheek. On the chilled sideline, Alonzo Johnson bent at the waist and clutched his belly with his hands, trying to hold the moment inside. When he straightened up, it was clear he'd failed. The rough, tough Florida linebacker was crying, weeping not only for the SEC championship the Gators had won, but for the 50 others they hadn't. Fittingly, it didn't come easy. To have waited 50 years and then won easily wouldn't have purged Gator souls the way Saturday's victory did. Now, what the hell is going on here? These people are kids. They're 19, 20 years old. They've only been playing football at the university an average of 2 years. The people in the stands haven't gone to every game for 50 years and cried over the losses. What's happening here? This was a cultural transmission of the values of the football team to all of the fans, all of the commentators, all of the players in a very short period of time. Anyone involved with that university, probably in a matter of months, was fully indoctrinated with the history of the University of Florida's football team. They incorporated and assimilated all of that information to a gut emotional feeling that spilled out as if they had personally lost every one of those championships until that year. Now, I think in the same way, transmissions of all kinds of cultural values take place over the years, over the decades, and even over the centuries. How could we have had the 1930s if we hadn't had the exuberance of the 1920s? How could we have had the rebuilding of the 1950s if we hadn't gone through World War II? And certainly, how could we have had the ebullient, crazy 1960s if for a decade or more people hadn't built very conservatively and very powerfully, year after year, a reserve big enough to begin throwing a nice party? How could we have had the 1970s, the reactionary 70s, if we hadn't overdone it in the 60s? And how could we have experienced the bootstrap psychology of the 1980s? Let's get ourselves back in shape, everywhere from government to personal jogging, if we hadn't gone through the 70s, which most people considered a negative psychological period. I say we couldn't have, that each change is born from the preceding conditions and is ready to generate the next change. The market acts the same way. Now, just as valid, I think, is the question, okay, maybe I'm convinced that this kind of thing could happen over the long term, but you're also telling me that on the short term, you're seeing the same structures. That if I'm looking at a 3-year bull market that takes a 5-wave shape, the intermediate term advance of wave 1 is taking a 5-wave shape, and wave 1 of that took a 5-wave shape, and wave 1 of that, and so forth, all the way down to things I can barely measure. Well, my answer to that is, so far there has been absolutely no evidence to indicate otherwise. Does mass psychology really operate at the level to create 5 up and 3 down, or 5 down and 3 up in a correction on, say, a matter of a few hours? The answer is yes. We've been watching quote machines now for several years which give you tick-by-tick data. You can make 5-minute bars, 15-minute bars, and 30-minute bars, and sure enough, the Elliott Wave pattern continues to show up.